The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned much like any other tranquil Sunday across the Hawaiian Islands, particularly at Wheeler Field. As the tropical sun began its ascent, most aviators were still immersed in slumber or enjoying a leisurely breakfast, unaware of the impending cataclysm. It was precisely at 7:48 a.m. that the sudden, jarring crackle of a radio transmission shattered the morning's peace. Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Among those jolted awake was Second Lieutenant George Welch, who, having spent the previous night engaged in a poker game, had managed to snatch only about 3 hours of sleep before the terrifying concussions began. His immediate thoughts were not of grand acts of valor or securing a place in historical annals. Instead, his singular focus was on ascending into the sky before the relentless Japanese assault obliterated every single aircraft still grounded. Wheeler Field was instantly plunged into an abyss of pandemonium. Maintenance crews scrambled frantically between the hangars, their movements a blur of desperate activity, while officers bellowed out a cacophony of contradictory commands. The ominous, distant rumble of bombs detonating upon Pearl Harbor's battleship row intensified with each passing second, growing into a deafening crescendo. Unwilling to await official authorization, Welch and his wingman, Kenneth Taylor, took decisive action. They swiftly commandeered a vehicle, embarking on a 10-mile dash to Hollywa Field. This auxiliary airfield was where a contingent of P-40 Warhawks had been strategically dispersed for training maneuvers. Upon arrival, they immediately enlisted the aid of mechanics to arm and refuel 2 fighters. There was no time for a meticulously crafted flight plan, nor for any tactical briefing. Their actions were driven purely by raw, primal instinct and a surge of adrenaline. By 8:15 a.m., Welch's P-40B was hurtling down the unpaved runway, its engine roaring in a desperate bid for ascent. The Japanese had orchestrated this surprise attack with chilling, almost surgical precision. The initial wave alone comprised a formidable force of 183 aircraft, spearheaded by the formidable Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and the agile Aichi D-3A dive bombers. Intelligence assessments had confidently predicted that the Americans would be utterly incapable of launching any aircraft into the fray. Their projections were, tragically, almost entirely accurate. Out of an estimated nearly 400 aircraft strategically positioned across Oahu, only a mere handful managed to achieve liftoff that fateful morning. Among this small, valiant group was George Welch. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. As Welch's P-40 ascended through the 2,000-foot mark, his eyes scanned the vast expanse of the sky, and there they were, not just a solitary enemy plane or a pair, but an entire, menacing formation. 15 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, their mission over Pearl Harbor seemingly accomplished, were returning from their bombing runs. They flew in precise, tight V formations at an approximate altitude of 3,500 feet, confidently heading back toward their waiting aircraft carriers, likely the Akagi or Kaga, believing their destructive task was complete. Conventional fighter doctrine would have dictated that Welch ascend to an altitude of 5,000 or even 6,000 feet, thereby securing a crucial altitude advantage from which to initiate a high-speed dive. The P-40's Allison engine was renowned for its exceptional dive performance, and mastering energy tactics was a fundamental lesson ingrained in every pilot during flight school. However, Welch glanced at his fuel gauge. He had taken off with perhaps only 45 minutes of combat fuel, and a protracted climb would consume invaluable minutes. His gaze returned to the bombers, which were already commencing their gradual descent toward the ocean, regrouping for the arduous journey back. It was then that Welch made a decision that would undoubtedly have been deemed utterly reckless, if not outright insane, by any seasoned flight instructor at Randolph Field. He decisively pushed the stick forward, sending his aircraft plunging toward the very surface of the waves. Welch had a mere 15 seconds to fully grasp the enormity of the challenge before him. 15 Japanese dive bombers, each manned by a 3-person crew, and still bristling with defensive machine guns. While the Aichi D-3A might have already unleashed its devastating 550-pound bomb over Pearl Harbor, it was far from defenseless. Each VAL was equipped with 2 forward-firing 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns, complemented by a rear-facing 7.7 mm flexible mount expertly operated by the radio operator. In a typical engagement scenario, this meant Welch would confront at least 15 rear gunners the instant he positioned himself for an attack run. The numerical disparity was stark and unforgiving. His P-40B was armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each supplied with approximately 200 rounds. This amounted to roughly 1,200 rounds in total, a figure that appears impressive until one considers the firing duration. Given the M2 Browning's cyclic rate of roughly 750 to 850 rounds per minute, Welch had, at best, about 90 seconds of continuous trigger time before his formidable guns would fall silent. 90 precious seconds to incapacitate 15 enemy aircraft, while simultaneously enduring their retaliatory fire. The altitude advantage was the undisputed golden rule of aerial combat, a principle understood by every pilot from their very first day of tactical training. This fundamental concept traced its origins back to World War I, when pioneering aviators, like Oswald Bolt, formalized energy fighting into established doctrine. Height invariably translated to speed, which in turn unlocked a multitude of tactical options. The strategy was clear: dive upon the adversary from above, harness gravity to build formidable velocity, execute the attack pass, and then swiftly climb back to a position of safety before the enemy could effectively react. The P-40 was inherently engineered for precisely this type of engagement. Its diving speed was extraordinary, and in a vertical confrontation, it possessed the raw power to overpower most Japanese aircraft. However, ascending to 6,000 feet would necessitate 3 to 4 minutes, with the Allison D-1710 engine operating at its maximum power output. By that crucial point, the Japanese formation would have advanced 5 miles closer to the sanctuary of their carriers, and would potentially be under the protective umbrella of the Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had initially escorted them to Pearl Harbor. Welch had already observed at least 3 Zeros strafing ground targets during his takeoff. These enemy pilots would undoubtedly respond the very moment they detected an American fighter climbing into an attack position. He would find himself outnumbered by a staggering ratio of 20 to 1 before he could even unleash his inaugural burst of fire. Crucially, the Japanese were not anticipating any resistance at this juncture. Their intelligence had confidently assured them that American fighters would be annihilated on the ground, and even if a few managed to become airborne, they would be disorganized and easily neutralized by the established combat air patrol. The VAL crews were likely in a state of relaxation, meticulously consulting their maps, calculating fuel consumption for the long journey back. They were maintaining strict radio silence, flying at a precise 3,200 feet in textbook 3-plane V formations, probably already anticipating the comforting prospect of a hot meal awaiting them on the carrier. Welch's audacious decision to descend to a low altitude was not merely unconventional. It flagrantly contravened every tenet he had ever been taught. Yet, moments of desperation often possess a profound ability to clarify one's options. He recognized that he could not outline them. He could not afford to wait for reinforcements that simply did not exist. What he could do, however, was become utterly unpredictable. The Japanese rear gunners were rigorously trained to scan the sky above and behind them, not the vast expanse of the ocean surface. If he could maintain an altitude below 50 feet, cleverly utilizing the undulating Pacific swells as natural terrain cover, he might just manage to approach close enough to make those 6.50 caliber machine guns count before the enemy even registered his presence. The P-40 Warhawk was decidedly not engineered for wave-hopping maneuvers. Its liquid-cooled Allison engine featured a substantial radiator scoop position beneath the fuselage, meaning that a single miscalculation at 50 feet, a fleeting moment of inattention, or an unexpected rogue ocean swell would inevitably send Welch hurtling uncontrollably into the vast, unforgiving Pacific. However, this audacious tactic offered one monumental advantage: invisibility. At ultra-low altitude, the P-40's camouflage paint scheme seamlessly blended with the dark, reflective surface of the ocean, and the Japanese rear gunners, diligently scanning for threats at their own altitude or above, were simply not looking downwards. Welch momentarily eased back on the throttle to prevent overshooting, his gaze unswervingly fixed on the lead V formation. Ocean spray began to lash against his windscreen. The altimeter's needle danced erratically between 40 and 60 feet. Every primal instinct screamed at him to climb, to escape the perilous proximity of the water, but he maintained a steadfast grip on the stick. The physiological stress was immense. Flying at such an incredibly low altitude demanded absolute, unyielding concentration. A post-war study conducted by the Naval Air Development Center revealed that pilots engaged in sustained flight below 100 feet experienced heart rates exceeding 160 beats per minute and suffered significantly diminished reaction times due to the onset of tunnel vision. Welch was operating precisely within this demanding zone, his peripheral vision narrowing, his entire focus now consumed by the bombers, which were just 800 yards ahead. The lead bomber in the formation was flying marginally lower than the others, gradually descending toward the water as the entire group prepared for the long, uneventful cruise back. Welch skillfully pulled up to 70 feet, angling slightly to the right to avoid the direct line of fire from the rear gunner, and patiently waited until he was a mere 400 yards away. At this precise distance, the convergence pattern of his 6.50 caliber guns created a highly concentrated cone of fire, approximately 6 feet in diameter. The M2 Browning discharged a formidable 710 grain bullet at an astonishing 2,900 feet per second, generating sufficient kinetic energy to effortlessly punch through the valve's aluminum airframe and penetrate its vital systems. He squeezed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered violently as all 6 guns simultaneously erupted. Tracers arced across the intervening gap in less than a second. The rear gunner on the lead valve was still scanning the skies above when the initial rounds tore mercilessly through the fuselage. The bomber's right-wing root instantly exploded in a chaotic spray of fuel and shredded metal. The aircraft violently rolled inverted, and then catastrophically smashed into the ocean at an unforgiving speed of 180 miles per hour. There were no parachutes, no time for any reaction, just a stark white splash and a scattering of debris. The second bomber within the V formation registered the arcing tracers far too late. Its pilot desperately attempted to bank left, but Welch was already expertly adjusting his aim. Another precise 2-second burst. This time, the rounds meticulously walked up the fuselage from the tail section directly into the cockpit. The valve's canopy shattered into countless fragments, and the aircraft pitched violently into a steep dive, trailing thick, black smoke. It impacted the water just 3 seconds later. 2 enemy aircraft eliminated in less than 20 seconds. Now, the Japanese formation erupted into utter chaos. Radio discipline completely disintegrated as pilots frantically shouted warnings to one another. The third bomber in the lead V formation executed a sharp break to the right, its rear gunner finally spotting the P-40 skimming perilously close to the waves. Welch observed the distinct muzzle flashes as the 7.7 mm Type 97 machine gun opened fire, but the gunner's aim was directed at where Welch had been, not where he was currently heading. The rounds passed harmlessly overhead. Welch executed a swift roll to the left, maintaining his wave top level, and then skillfully positioned himself underneath the turning bomber's belly, a critical blind spot where the rear gunner was unable to depress his weapon low enough to track the aggressor. Another decisive burst. The valve's engine cowling disintegrated, and a torrent of coolant sprayed across the windscreen. The pilot was desperately struggling to maintain control, but the Aichi's single 1,000 horsepower Kinsei engine was failing. The bomber slowed perceptibly, staggered precariously, and then pancaked violently into the ocean, skipping twice across the surface before ultimately breaking apart. I am from the United States, and I find the video topic incredibly compelling. It highlights the often overlooked individual acts of heroism during the chaos of war, showcasing the incredible bravery and quick thinking of pilots like George Welch. It's a powerful reminder of how unexpected tactics and sheer determination can make a profound difference in the face of overwhelming odds. The enemy aircraft, having been struck twice, disintegrated in midair. Within a mere 90 seconds, 3 of the Japanese bombers had been decisively eliminated, leaving a contingent of 12 still airborne. At this critical juncture, every member of the remaining formation became acutely aware that an American fighter pilot was relentlessly pursuing them from beneath. Consequently, the Japanese formation dispersed, a stark deviation from their established protocol. Typically, when subjected to fighter assaults, bomber crews were trained to consolidate their ranks, intensify their defensive firepower, and rigorously preserve their formation's cohesion. However, this particular engagement defied conventional aerial combat strategies. The assailant, Welch, was not descending from an elevated position where his approach could be visually tracked and defensive maneuvers coordinated. Instead, he was emerging from the turbulent expanse of the ocean surface with predatory suddenness, akin to a formidable shark, delivering potent strikes before vanishing back into the crests of the waves, denying the enemy gunners any opportunity to acquire a precise targeting solution. The profound psychological repercussions of this unorthodox tactic were undeniably crippling for the Japanese crews. Attempting to ascend to a higher altitude in pursuit of security, the 4th bomber committed a critical error. As it peeled away from the ocean's expanse, its airspeed decelerated significantly, plummeting from 200 knots to an estimated 160 knots. This ill-fated maneuver inadvertently exposed the entirety of its vulnerable underbelly to Welch's formidable weaponry. The American pilot skillfully ascended to an altitude of 150 feet, meticulously aligning his P-40 with the bomber's upward trajectory, and unleashed a concentrated 3-second fusillade directly into the wing root, precisely where the volatile fuel tanks were situated. The valve's wing, subjected to this brutal assault, buckled dramatically, folding upwards at a 90-degree angle. The stricken aircraft then executed 2 rapid snap rolls before plummeting vertically towards the unforgiving waters below, its crew tragically unable to escape the doomed machine. At this juncture, Welch's internal ammunition counter indicated that he had expended approximately 400 rounds, representing a substantial third of his overall ordnance capacity. Concurrently, his fuel gauge registered a more rapid decline than initially anticipated, a testament to the strenuous demands of the engagement. The powerful Allison engine, operating at its maximum combat thrust, was consuming aviation fuel at an accelerated rate, a consequence of the intense aerial maneuvers. Furthermore, the relentless, low-altitude dogfighting was significantly diminishing his operational range. Welch was acutely aware that he possessed perhaps only 20 minutes of remaining combat endurance before a critical decision point would be reached: either disengage and return to base, or confront the perilous prospect of an emergency water landing far from friendly territory. Nevertheless, the potent surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins effectively suppressed any logical considerations regarding prudent fuel conservation, impelling him to press the attack. We invite you to stay with us and witness the dramatic conclusion of this compelling narrative. Your support, in the form of a like and a subscription, would be profoundly appreciated. We also encourage you to share your thoughts on this video's topic and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. Subsequently, a pair of bombers within the second V-shaped formation attempted a synchronized turn, cunningly designed to enable both their rear gunners to engage Welch's fighter concurrently. This tactical maneuver was undeniably astute, aiming to establish a formidable crossfire barrage that would compel the American pilot to either disengage his attack or brave a perilous gauntlet of incoming projectiles. However, Welch, demonstrating remarkable foresight, had already discerned their intention. Rather than committing to a direct pursuit into their turning maneuver, he executed an abrupt and decisive hard left reversal, plunging back down to an astonishing 50 feet above the water, thereby vanishing entirely from their visual field. Consequently, the Japanese rear gunners expended their ammunition into vacant airspace, utterly unaware that Welch had skillfully repositioned himself approximately 800 yards distant, rendered imperceptible against the somber expanse of the ocean surface. Welch re-engaged the enemy formation, executing his approach from a precise 45-degree angle, with his sights firmly fixed on the bomber positioned on the outermost arc of the turn. The pilot of this particular aircraft exhibited commendable skill. The instant he detected the telltale streaks of tracer fire, he swiftly cut his throttle and deployed his flaps, a calculated attempt to induce Welch to overshoot his target. Yet, the P-40 possessed superior energy management capabilities compared to the Val. Welch adeptly adjusted his power settings, judiciously extending his attack run by an additional 2 seconds, and meticulously walked his gunfire from the bomber's tail section progressively forward. The aircraft's rudder was the first component to disintegrate under the relentless barrage, followed by the elevator, until finally the concentrated rounds found their mark within the main fuselage. The critically damaged Val then pitched onto its back and plunged irrevocably into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. 5 enemy aircraft had now been unequivocally destroyed. The profound psychological impact inherent in the wave-hopping combat methodology became starkly evident at this juncture of the engagement. Japanese bomber crews were rigorously indoctrinated in the intricacies of high-altitude formation flying and the implementation of coordinated defensive maneuvers against orthodox fighter assaults. Their training regimens meticulously covered protocols for responding to American fighters diving from superior altitudes or launching attacks from the flanks. Crucially, no instruction had ever prepared them for the unprecedented scenario of a solitary fighter pilot launching relentless attacks from beneath sea level. Subsequent analysis of radio transmissions intercepted by American intelligence listening posts after the cessation of hostilities revealed an atmosphere of utter bewilderment pervading the Japanese formations. Pilots frantically questioned the whereabouts of the elusive fighter, while rear gunners reported a complete inability to visually acquire the incoming threat. Amidst this escalating chaos, Formation leaders desperately endeavored to restore order as their aircraft vanished, one after another, from the skies. Welch secured his sixth confirmed kill by intercepting a straggling bomber that had fallen behind the main formation in its struggle to maintain cohesion. This particular valve already exhibited discernible indications of damage, potentially sustained from the intense anti-aircraft barrages over Pearl Harbor. It was observed flying with its nose slightly elevated, visibly struggling to sustain its altitude. Welch executed his approach from directly astern, maintaining an incredibly low altitude at wave-top level, before smoothly ascending to 60 feet and unleashing a brief, precise burst of gunfire. The bomber's engine instantly seized, its propeller abruptly ceasing its rotation and windmilling to a halt. The pilot made a desperate attempt to ditch the crippled aircraft in the ocean, but at an unforgiving speed of 180 knots, the valve impacted the water with the force of concrete, cartwheeling violently for an estimated 200 yards across the surface before ultimately succumbing to the depths. With this successful engagement, 6 Japanese aircraft had been annihilated, with 9 still remaining. The barrels of Welch's machine guns were now radiating significant heat from their sustained use. His remaining ammunition reserves had dwindled to below 50% of his initial load, and his hands, gripped in constant tension on the control stick during the demanding ultra-low altitude maneuvers, were beginning to cramp painfully. Despite these mounting physical and logistical challenges, his resolve remained unbroken. The sheer audacity and unconventional nature of his tactical approach were proving devastatingly effective. The Japanese forces found themselves utterly incapable of orchestrating a coherent defensive strategy against an adversary they could neither consistently observe nor reliably anticipate. The profound effectiveness of the wave-hopping strategy stemmed not merely from the element of surprise, but was deeply rooted in fundamental principles of physics. At sea level, the atmospheric density is approximately 0.0765 pounds per cubic foot, a substantial contrast to the 0.0565 pounds per cubic foot encountered at an altitude of 10,000 feet. This significant 26% increase in air density meant that Welch's formidable .50 caliber Browning machine guns were discharging their projectiles through a denser medium. Counterintuitively, this thicker atmosphere actually imparted greater stability to the bullet trajectories over shorter distances. The rounds exhibited reduced vertical drop and lateral drift within the more substantial air, thereby rendering his gun convergence pattern both tighter and more reliably predictable across engagement ranges spanning 300 to 500 yards. The P-40's armament was meticulously harmonized to achieve optimal convergence at 300 yards, a conventional setting designed to yield the utmost concentration of firepower at that precise distance. In contrast, at elevated altitudes, the attenuated air and extended engagement ranges typically cause bullets to disperse more widely during their flight, consequently diminishing the probability of successful hits. However, operating at a mere 50 feet above the surface, Welch was consistently engaging his targets within the optimal range of 250 to 400 yards, a critical, sweet spot, where all 6 streams of gunfire coalesced into a devastating, concentrated cone. Each press of the trigger unleashed an astonishing torrent of approximately 40 rounds per second into a target area no larger than a standard kitchen table. Conversely, the Japanese valve bombers found themselves at an extreme disadvantage due to their inherently unfavorable defensive geometry. Their rear-mounted 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns possessed severely restricted depression angles. A gunner, constrained by the physical limitations of the aircraft's design, was unable to depress the weapon by more than approximately 30 degrees below the horizontal plane of the bomber. When Welch initiated his attacks from the precarious wavetop level, he was approaching from an upward angle of between 40 and 50 degrees relative to the gunner's vantage point. To effectively engage him, the gunner would have been required to physically lean outside the aircraft's fuselage and discharge the weapon almost vertically downwards, a maneuver rendered mechanically impossible by the fixed limitations of the gun mount. Consequently, the Val's entire defensive armament, which had been specifically engineered to counter fighter threats originating from above or on the same level, was rendered utterly impotent and effectively neutralized against Welch's unique attack vector. Furthermore, a crucial factor was the altered target silhouette presented to Welch. When observing an aircraft from a superior or level perspective, one typically perceives the slender profile of its fuselage and wings, which constitutes a comparatively diminutive target area. However, as Welch gazed upwards at the approaching Vals from his low-altitude position, he was presented with an expansive view of their entire wingspan, the full, vulnerable underside of the fuselage, and the broad expanse of the horizontal stabilizer. This dramatic shift in perspective effectively increased the target aspect by approximately 200%. This phenomenon operates on the very same fundamental principle that underscored the critical importance of belly gunners aboard B-17 bombers during World War II. Aircraft inherently exhibit their greatest vulnerability from below, precisely because this angle exposes the largest possible target area to an attacker. The intricacies of human vision also contributed significantly to Welch's tactical advantage. Extensive research undertaken by the Army Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine in 1943 conclusively demonstrated that pilots, when actively searching for potential aerial threats, instinctively direct their gaze towards the horizon line and the airspace above it. This ingrained behavior is deeply rooted in our evolutionary instincts, which historically associate danger with threats descending from higher vantage points. The Japanese rear gunners, in this context, were severely hampered by a phenomenon termed altitude bias, consistently fixating their attention on the 6 o'clock high and 3 o'clock high positions, while tragically neglecting the critical airspace directly below them. By the time their cognitive processes managed to register that the imminent threat was, in fact, materializing from beneath, Welch had already executed his devastating attack and rapidly disengaged. Welch masterfully capitalized on yet another unforgiving aspect of low-altitude aerial combat, the utter absence of any margin for error on the part of the defending aircraft. Had he inflicted damage upon a bomber at an altitude of 3,000 feet, the crew would have been afforded precious time to meticulously assess the extent of the damage, potentially attempt rudimentary in-flight repairs, or meticulously prepare for a controlled ditching maneuver. However, when operating at a mere 200 feet with battle damage, pilots were granted a perilous window of perhaps only 3 seconds from the initial loss of control to catastrophic impact. The 7th bomber he successfully engaged served as a poignant illustration of this brutal reality. Welch's precision gunfire scored critical hits on the port wing, resulting in the severing of vital control cables. The pilot valiantly attempted to compensate for the catastrophic damage using rudder and aileron inputs, but at that perilous altitude and unforgiving speed, the aircraft instantaneously snapped inverted and plunged directly into the ocean. There was no available altitude for any hope of recovery, no opportunity for a second chance. The robust performance characteristics of the Allison engine at sea level also furnished Welch with a distinct and decisive advantage. While the V-1710 power plant typically encountered significant performance degradation at elevated altitudes without the aid of a supercharger, at sea level it was capable of generating its full, impressive output of 1,050 horsepower. This enabled the P-40 to sustain a formidable speed of 340 miles per hour in level flight at low altitudes. In stark contrast, the Japanese VALs, already operating at reduced speeds following their bombing runs and now engaged in desperate defensive maneuvers, were likely maintaining airspeeds of only 180 to 200 knots. This disparity provided Welch with a commanding speed advantage of approximately 100 miles per hour, a critical factor that empowered him to meticulously select his attack angles, dictate the optimal engagement ranges, and disengage from combat before the beleaguered Japanese crews could effectively coordinate any counter-tactics. The 9 remaining enemy bombers, despite their losses, were not prepared to capitulate without a determined struggle. Their formation leader, presumably a seasoned veteran possessing considerable combat experience from the protracted conflict in China, began to implement a series of intricate evasive tactics. Deviating from their previous strategy of maintaining consistent altitude and predictable flight paths, the VALs initiated a sequence of erratic jinking maneuvers, characterized by shallow S-turns, brief ascents, and subsequent descents, each designed to complicate Welch's ability to achieve a stable gun solution. These countermeasures proved to be partially effective. His subsequent 2 attack runs, while resulting in successful hits, regrettably did not culminate in definitive kills. Rounds were observed stitching across the fuselage of one aircraft without striking any critical systems, while another concentrated burst merely shredded a tail section, yet the resilient bomber continued its flight. The relentless bomber persisted in its flight, seemingly impervious to damage. Welch's ammunition reserves were rapidly dwindling to a critical state. He had already expended approximately 800 rounds, representing 2/3 of his total carrying capacity. A swift mental calculation indicated he had barely 40 seconds of firing time remaining, emphasizing the absolute necessity of making every single burst count. Simultaneously, the immense G-forces imposed by his continuous, aggressive maneuvering were exacting a severe physical toll. Each sharp turn executed at low altitude subjected him to 3 to 4 Gs, and such sustained gravitational loading invariably caused blood to pool in the lower extremities, thereby diminishing the vital oxygen supply to the brain. Pilots typically began to experience tunnel vision around the 4G threshold, and Welch had been enduring these punishing loads repeatedly for nearly 8 uninterrupted minutes. His fuel gauge now registered a mere 20 minutes of flight time remaining. With Wheeler Field situated roughly 15 miles away, he could deduce that he had perhaps only 5 more minutes of active combat before he would be compelled to disengage or face the catastrophic risk of running out of fuel over the vast ocean. Yet, a similar sense of desperation was beginning to grip the Japanese aviators. 2 enemy bombers abruptly deviated from their formation and plunged towards the surface of the water, attempting to employ Welch's own tactical innovation against him by descending to wavetop level, where they believed they would be significantly more challenging to track. While this demonstrated astute thinking, the VAL aircraft was fundamentally ill-suited for the kind of ultra-low altitude, high-G maneuvering that the P-40 excelled at. Welch swiftly identified and targeted the first low-flying VAL, approaching from its 4 o'clock position, a notoriously difficult angle for the rear gunner. However, this particular gunner proved either exceptionally courageous or remarkably proficient. He leaned precariously out of the canopy and opened fire regardless, despite the gun mount being at the absolute extreme limit of its traverse. Streaks of tracer ammunition zipped past Welch's canopy with such proximity that he could distinctly observe them. One round violently punched through his left wing, leaving a fist-sized aperture just 3 feet from the cockpit. The P-40 shuddered violently, but miraculously maintained its structural integrity. Welch responded with a controlled 2-second burst of fire. The Val's engine subsequently detonated in a spectacular spray of oil and fragmented metal. 7 enemy aircraft were now definitively downed. The original enemy formation was now in a state of complete disarray. Some bombers were frantically climbing, others were diving erratically, a handful still attempted to adhere to their initial course, while the remainder scattered wildly in disparate directions. This chaotic fragmentation was precisely the tactical advantage Welch needed, a collection of isolated targets rather than a cohesive, coordinated defensive unit. He quickly identified a Val endeavoring to climb back to an altitude of 2,000 feet, likely in the desperate hope of gaining sufficient height to bail out should their situation become untenable. Welch pulled his P-40 up to 400 feet, the highest he had ascended since the commencement of the engagement, and intercepted the bomber during a climbing left turn. This Japanese pilot, realizing his peril, attempted a desperate maneuver, a split S, which involved rolling inverted and pulling down to reverse direction. While an effective defensive tactic at higher altitudes, executing it at 1,800 feet with a heavily loaded bomber was tantamount to suicide. The Val rolled onto its back, and as the pilot pulled on the controls, the aircraft simply lacked the necessary energy to complete the maneuver. It stalled, inverted, plummeted through 1,000 feet, and impacted the ocean in a vertical dive. Welch had not even needed to fire a single round. 8 enemy aircraft were now accounted for. We invite you to stay with us and watch the thrilling conclusion of this video. We would be incredibly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also share a comment below, telling us where you are from, and what you think about this captivating video topic. 2 additional Vals executed a coordinated break towards a burgeoning cloud bank in the northeast. Welch initiated a pursuit, but his critically low fuel status forced an immediate strategic decision. He could either continue the chase and risk running completely dry, or he could concentrate his efforts on the remaining targets still within easy striking distance. He opted for the latter, prioritizing targets of opportunity. A Val, visibly struggling to maintain any semblance of formation, became his 9th victim. A sustained 5-second burst ignited an engine fire that the crew proved utterly incapable of extinguishing. The bomber then descended in a controlled spiral, leaving a thick trail of smoke until it ultimately plunged into the water approximately 3 miles offshore. His gun barrels, now glowing an intense red, were distinctly visible even in the full light of day. The Browning M2 machine gun was designed to sustain roughly 150 rounds per minute of continuous fire before reaching critical overheating. Welch had been operating his weapons far in excess of this rate. Consequently, 2 of his 6 guns had already jammed irrevocably due to extreme heat expansion. He was now reduced to merely 4 functioning weapons and an estimated 200 rounds of ammunition in total. His hands had become numb from the incessant vibrations. His neck muscles were screaming in protest from the constant strain of craning to track targets, and his fuel gauge bounced ominously around the 15-minute mark. Welch then spotted 3 more Vals flying in a visibly ragged formation, making a desperate dash for the horizon. They were flying lower now, perhaps at an altitude of 800 feet, and their pilots were unequivocally pushing their engines to their absolute limits. He could clearly discern the exhaust trails darkening as they advanced their throttles beyond normal cruise settings, a telltale sign of emergency power. These enemy crews undoubtedly knew they were being relentlessly hunted, and their only conceivable chance of survival lay in reaching their aircraft carriers before the lone American fighter could systematically pick them off. However, Welch harbored absolutely no intention of permitting their escape. He expertly positioned his P-40 some 200 yards directly behind the trailing bomber and initiated a stern chase. The P-40, while faster, held only a marginal advantage. With the valves operating at their emergency power settings, Welch was gaining perhaps 5 miles per hour on them, which implied it would take nearly 2 agonizing minutes to close the distance to an effective firing range. 2 minutes he most likely did not possess given his precarious fuel situation. Yet, something profound within Welch's mindset had transcended rational calculation. He had just annihilated 9 enemy aircraft in less than 12 minutes, an achievement that had seemed utterly impossible when he had first sighted the formation. The remaining bombers, he resolved, were not going to escape his grasp. At a distance of 600 yards, he unleashed a long, sustained burst of fire, acutely aware that his reduced number of operational guns necessitated extended trigger time to achieve the desired hit density. Streams of tracer ammunition arced purposefully towards the trailing valve. The enemy rear gunner, in a desperate act of defiance, returned fire, but his rounds visibly fell short. The 7.7 Type 97 machine gun possessed an effective range of perhaps 500 yards, and any semblance of accuracy beyond 400 yards was largely wishful thinking. Welch's formidable .50 caliber weapons, in stark contrast, retained their lethal efficacy well past 1,000 yards. Soon, Welch's powerful rounds began to connect with devastating effect. The valve's right horizontal stabilizer absorbed multiple direct hits, causing the aircraft to commence a slow, uncontrollable roll to starboard. The pilot frantically wrestled with the controls, but streams of hydraulic fluid visibly sprayed from severed lines, indicating catastrophic system failure. The bomber inverted completely and plummeted out of the formation. 10 enemy aircraft were now destroyed. A stark red fuel warning light suddenly flashed, signaling Welch's critical predicament. He had perhaps only 8 minutes of flight time remaining. This meager reserve was insufficient to reach Haleiwa and definitively inadequate to make it back to Wheeler Field. Yet, the 2 last valves were tantalizingly close, positioned just 500 yards ahead and slightly beneath him. With a surge of defiant determination, he jammed the throttle to full military power for one final, desperate push. The Allison engine responded with a thunderous roar, its temperature gauges rapidly spiking into the ominous red zone. Army Air Force regulations explicitly stipulated that maximum continuous power should never be maintained for more than 5 minutes to avert catastrophic engine damage. Welch, however, had been operating at or near this extreme threshold for almost 15 minutes. The imminent failure of his engine was no longer a question of if, but merely a matter of when. He rapidly diminished the distance, closing to a mere 300 yards behind the penultimate bomber. This valve's rear gunner, demonstrating extraordinary tenacity, continued to engage, delivering disciplined bursts in a valiant effort to safeguard his aircraft and its crew. Welch retaliated with his own fire. His ammunition counter abruptly registered 0 on 2 more guns, leaving him with only 2 operational .50 caliber machine guns and an estimated 50 rounds remaining. Undeterred, he pressed the trigger regardless. The last functioning weapons chattered for a mere 3 seconds before they, too, fell silent, completely expended. Crucially, those final projectiles found their mark. The valve's port wing root catastrophically disintegrated, leading to the complete separation of the wing from the fuselage. The crippled bomber immediately snap-rolled into an irreversible, uncontrolled spin. 11 enemy aircraft were now confirmed destroyed. Only a single valve now remained, a lone bomber desperately fleeing towards the distant horizon, relentlessly pursued by a solitary P-40. Both aircraft were operating on the barest remnants of their fuel, running on fumes. Welch, critically, had no ammunition left whatsoever. His engine temperature gauges had surged past all critical limits, and his fuel indicator ominously displayed a maximum of 5 minutes of flight time. The entirely rational, self-preserving decision would have been to disengage, reverse course, and attempt to reach land before his engine inevitably failed. However, driven by an almost superhuman resolve, Welch steadfastly maintained his pursuit. He relentlessly narrowed the gap, closing to 200 yards, then a mere 100, maintaining an impeccable formation directly astern of the fleeing Val. The enemy rear gunner, still firing, produced visible muzzle flashes, but the extreme angle rendered his efforts futile, with rounds passing harmlessly beneath the P-40's fuselage. At an astonishingly close distance of 50 yards, Welch executed an utterly unprecedented maneuver. He drew alongside the Val, precisely matching its speed and altitude, flying wingtip to wingtip in an almost surreal parallel. The Japanese pilot, in a moment of profound, perhaps bewildered, recognition, turned his head and stared directly at Welch across the narrow expanse separating their aircraft. The thoughts that raced through that pilot's mind in that instant are forever lost to the annals of history, but the events that transpired next would irrevocably become the stuff of legend. With audacious precision, Welch edged his P-40 even closer, strategically employing his aircraft's wing to deliberately disrupt the smooth airflow over the Val's wing. This sophisticated technique, known as aerodynamic interference, leverages the principle that in exceptionally close formation, the turbulent air generated by one aircraft's wing can profoundly destabilize the flight characteristics of another. The Val immediately began to rock violently from side to side, its pilot visibly struggling to regain control. Welch, exhibiting extraordinary skill and nerve, steadfastly maintained his position, his wing a mere 20 feet from the bombers, continuously generating destabilizing turbulence. The Japanese pilot, in a desperate attempt to break free, banked sharply to the right, but his control inputs proved too aggressive under the compromised conditions. The Val abruptly stalled, snapped inverted, and plunged irrevocably into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. In this astonishing act of aerial mastery, Welch had just secured his 12th kill without expending a single round of ammunition. In the immediate aftermath, his engine sputtered ominously, a clear symptom of fuel starvation. The powerful Allison engine abruptly ceased, its propeller now merely windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. Welch found himself a perilous 12 miles from the nearest landmass, with a completely dead engine and an altitude of approximately 2,000 feet. The P-40's established glide ratio was roughly 8-to-1, meaning he would require approximately 1,500 feet of altitude to cover a single mile. The rudimentary calculations indicated a marginal possibility of reaching safety, but only just. With practiced precision, Welch trimmed the P-40 for its optimal glide speed, and indicated 110 miles per hour, and set his course directly for Wheeler Field. The P-40 was now enveloped in an unnerving silence, broken only by the rush of wind and the futile windmilling of its propeller. Gone were the familiar rumble of the engine and the subtle whine of hydraulic systems. Instead, an eerie quiet descended upon the 12,000-pound machine, now transformed into a massive glider descending towards the earth. In the distance, he could discern Wheeler Field, with plumes of smoke still ascending from hangars scarred by the Japanese assault. The runway, from 8 miles out, appeared impossibly diminutive. A visible stream of fuel trailed from his right wing, evidence of the bullet hole sustained earlier. While the control surfaces responded, their action was noticeably sluggish, indicating damage he had not perceived amidst the intensity of combat. Furthermore, the fuselage and tail section bore at least a dozen additional perforations, stark testimony to the numerous near misses from the enemy rear gunners that could have permanently terminated his mission. The P-40, remarkably, maintained its structural integrity through what seemed like sheer mechanical defiance, yet the impending landing presented formidable challenges. Devoid of engine power, he lacked the hydraulic pressure necessary for deploying flaps or extending the landing gear. His approach would be high-speed, wheels retracted, culminating in a perilous belly landing. The P-40 fighter plane was coming in hot, its landing gear retracted, skidding on its belly. At an altitude of 1,000 feet and positioned 4 miles from the landing strip, a stark realization washed over Welch. He had gravely misjudged the situation. The P-40's glide ratio, severely compromised by battle damage, was not performing as anticipated, leading to an alarmingly rapid descent. Instead of the optimal 125 feet per mile, the aircraft was plummeting at approximately 150 feet per mile. The runway at Wheeler Field was perilously close, an almost unattainable target. A fleeting thought of bailing out crossed his mind, but at 800 feet, the altitude was insufficient for a safe parachute deployment. He was irrevocably committed to guiding the damaged warbird to the ground. Emergency response teams at Wheeler Field had already detected the distress fighter. From their vantage point, they could clearly discern the inert propeller and the unnaturally steep descent angle of the aircraft. Fire trucks, their foam cannons charged and ready, began a frantic race towards the runway. At 400 feet, Welch skillfully guided the P-40 across the airfield boundary, maintaining a speed of 130 miles per hour, a full 20 knots faster than a standard landing approach. As he passed over the runway threshold at 200 feet, the critical moment arrived. At merely 100 feet, he executed a crucial maneuver, pulling back on the control stick to convert residual speed into a desperate surge of lift, striving to shed velocity before the inevitable impact. As the dire situation intensified, we urge you to stay with us and witness the dramatic conclusion of this incredible account. We would be profoundly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider sharing where you are from and what you think about the video topic in the comments section. The P-40 collided violently with the earth. The metallic underbelly of the fuselage shrieked against the concrete, emitting a sound akin to rending steel, as brilliant sparks erupted 30 feet behind the sliding aircraft. Despite the restraint of his harness, Welch's head was violently propelled forward, striking the gun sight. The battered plane continued its uncontrolled slide for 800 feet, grinding relentlessly across the tarmac, shedding fragments of its aluminum skin. Its harrowing journey concluded just 200 feet from the runway's terminus, its nose deeply embedded in the soil, the tail section dramatically angled skyward at a 30-degree incline. Welch, dazed but alive, methodically unstrapped himself, clambered out of the shattered cockpit, and dropped to the ground. His legs, weakened by an overwhelming surge of adrenaline and profound physical exhaustion, nearly gave way beneath him. A fire truck materialized within moments, its crew swiftly assisting him away from the wreckage, anticipating a potential blaze. Someone offered him a refreshing drink of water, while another inquired about his injuries. Welch, still attempting to fully comprehend the harrowing ordeal he had just survived, cast a lingering gaze back at the mangled P-40. In a mere 23 minutes of intense flight time, Welch had achieved an astonishing 12 confirmed aerial victories. However, subsequent official records would credit him with only 4, primarily due to the absence of corroborating witnesses for the remaining engagements. Nevertheless, those who had reviewed the gun camera footage and meticulously examined the bullet-riddled Japanese aircraft knew the undeniable truth of his extraordinary accomplishments. The audacious, wave-hopping tactic, which Welch had spontaneously improvised that fateful morning, rapidly became a pivotal case study in fighter weapons schools throughout the duration of the war. Marine Corps aviators operating in the Pacific theater swiftly adopted variations of this innovative approach when confronting Japanese bombers over vast expanses of water. This groundbreaking concept, which involved utilizing terrain, or, in Welch's specific instance, the ocean surface, as a means of concealment for launching attacks from unexpected angles, profoundly influenced tactical doctrine for many decades. Indeed, contemporary fighter tactics continue to incorporate principles such as terrain masking and low-altitude approaches, directly attributable to the lessons learned from engagements as pivotal as Welch's. For his extraordinary valor on December 7, 1941, George Welch was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. A significant number of observers believed his actions warranted the Medal of Honor, but a contentious debate surrounding whether he had received an official order to take off ultimately led to the conferral of the lesser award. Welch not only survived the war with a remarkable 16 confirmed kills, but also embarked on a distinguished career as a test pilot, becoming the first American to unofficially break the sound barrier in 1947, although Chuck Yeager later received official credit for the achievement. Tragically, Welch's life ended in 1954 when an F-100 Super Sabre he was testing disintegrated during a high-speed dive. Yet, on that pivotal Sunday morning over Pearl Harbor, Second Lieutenant George Welch unequivocally demonstrated that unparalleled tactical innovation and sheer audacity could indeed overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. 15 Japanese bombers had departed their carriers that morning, fully expecting an unmolested return journey. A staggering 12 of them never made it back to their ships. A solitary American pilot, flying alone at wave-top level, armed with nothing but raw instinct and .50 caliber machine guns, irrevocably rewrote the established rules of air combat during 23 minutes of absolute, unbridled chaos. This was not merely military history. It was a defining moment where profound desperation was miraculously transformed into tactical genius. And that single pilot's seemingly insane decision forged a legend that continues to be meticulously studied by fighter pilots, even 80 years later.